Hello, friend. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Just go ahead, get comfortable, and let yourself unwind, and let the day go for just a little while. And before we begin, just one small thing. This show is free of ads, and it always will be. Nothing here will ever interrupt you or wake you. What keeps it that way is you. A quiet subscribe, a kind comment, the little things. They help more than you know. Everyone has seen Stonehenge. We've all carried a picture of it since childhood, that grey ring of giants standing alone in the grass. And that's exactly what pulled me into this one. Because when I finally asked the simplest questions about it, who built it and how and why, I found that the first man who ever wrote its name down, 900 years ago, admitted he could not answer, and that we, with all our lasers and laboratories, have only just begun to. And stranger still, the wildest legend ever told about these stones, a tale of giants and a wizard and an impossible journey, turns out to rhyme with the truth in ways I still can't quite shake. So tonight, that's where we're going. We'll stand on the plain as the wind moves through the grass. We'll meet the medieval dreamer who gave the stones their first great story, and we'll follow the science, stone by stone, to the mountains of Wales and the far north of Scotland. And as we go, I'll be honest with you about which parts of this story are solid ground, which parts the experts still argue about, which parts became pure legend, and why the legend, after 900 years, refuses to die. So settle in, and let me take you back. There is a plain in the south of England, wide and green and gently rolling, where the wind moves through the grass for miles without meeting anything taller than a hawthorn tree. And in the middle of that plain, there is a ring of standing stones. The stones are grey and very large, and some of them are joined across the top by other stones lying flat, like doorways or like gates, so that from a distance the whole ring looks a little like a crown that somebody set down in the grass a very long time ago and never came back for. It is difficult, standing there, to hold in the mind how old it is. The ring was already ancient when the first stone of the Great Pyramid was cut in Egypt. It was standing and weathering and being wondered at before there was a city called Rome, before there was writing of any kind in Britain, before almost anything a person now thinks of as history had begun to happen. The oldest parts of it were made about 5,000 years ago by people who left no name and no word and no explanation. Only the work, and the work has outlasted every kingdom that has risen and fallen in all the miles of grass around it. And even that is not the beginning. When workmen were digging a car park beside the stones in the 1960s, they found, in the chalk, the sockets of enormous wooden posts, pine trunks the better part of a metre across, set upright in the ground and left to stand until they rotted. When the charcoal from those sockets was finally dated, it gave a number that seemed at first to be a mistake. The posts had been raised around 8,500 years before the present day, 4,000 years before the first stone was lifted. So the ground itself had been marked as a place that mattered while the last hunters of the old wild Britain still moved across it, following the deer through a country that had only lately lost its ice. Something about this particular stretch of plain drew people to it and kept drawing them for longer than all of recorded history laid end to end. Nobody knows what the posts meant. That is the first of very many things about this place that nobody knows, and it is worth saying plainly near the start, because the not knowing is not a gap in the story. The not knowing is the story. For most of the time that people have lived beside these stones, they have had no idea who made them. The builders left nothing that could be read, and so the first written word we have about Stonehenge is not an explanation at all. It is a man admitting that he cannot explain it. His name was Henry, and he was the Archdeacon of Huntingdon, and around the year 1130, He was compiling a history of the English, and somewhere in it, he paused to list the marvels of his country, the things in England that seemed to him to exceed the ordinary run of the world. There were 4 of them. There was a place in the peak where a wind came howling out of caverns in the hills. There was a cave in the west that swallowed rivers. There was the strange business of rain that seemed to gather on certain hilltops. And there was the second marvel, which he called in his Latin, Stanenges. He wrote that at Stonehenge, stones of a wonderful size had been raised up in the manner of doorways, so that doorways seemed to be set on top of doorways. And then he wrote the sentence that has never really been improved upon in 900 years of trying. No one, he said, can conceive by what art such great stones were raised so high, or for what purpose they were set there. That is the whole thing, in one line, from the very first person who ever bothered to write the name down. How and why? He could not answer either. Neither, for a very long time, could anyone else. And the astonishing part, the part worth keeping close through everything that follows, is that we have only in the last few years begun to answer the how, and we still cannot fully answer the why. But people cannot leave a silence like that alone. A great mysterious thing standing in a field is an invitation. And where there are no facts, there will be stories. And the stories came quickly. Only a few years after Henry set down his honest little confession of ignorance, a very different kind of writer gave Stonehenge the explanation it had been missing, a magnificent, detailed, and entirely invented one. His name was Geoffrey of Monmouth, a churchman from the Welsh borders who worked at Oxford, and around the year 1136, he produced a history of the kings of Britain that was mostly a work of imagination dressed as fact. It was enormously popular. It gave the world a great deal of what people now think they know about King Arthur, and it gave the world the wizard Merlin, and it gave Stonehenge an origin story so satisfying that it held the field for 500 years. In Geoffrey's telling, the stones are a war memorial. A British king wishes to honour hundreds of nobles treacherously massacred by the Saxons, and he wants a monument that will last forever, and the wizard Merlin tells him where to find one. There is a ring of great stones, Merlin says, standing on a mountain in Ireland, and it was set there by giants, who had carried the stones in the deep past from the furthest ends of Africa. And the stones are not ordinary. They are, in Geoffrey's Latin, mystical stones, of a medicinal virtue. The giants had washed them and poured the water into baths, and the sick who bathed in that water were cured, and no disease could hold against them. So a British army sails to Ireland to fetch them. And here Geoffrey does something quietly clever, something that turns out to matter. The soldiers try to move the stones by main force. 15,000 men set to work with ropes and cables and ladders, and they cannot so much as shift them. And then Merlin laughs. He laughs at their sweating and their heaving, and he assembles his own contrivances, his engines, his devices, and with these he takes the whole ring down more easily than can be believed, and loads the stones onto the ships. The lesson, which Geoffrey states outright, is that skill outdoes strength. Not muscle, and not even quite magic, but method and ingenuity, and the right machine in the hands of someone who has understood the problem. It is a strange thing to find at the centre of a 12th century wizard story, a small, cool insistence that an impossible stone is moved not by being strong, but by being clever. We will come back to that, because it is closer to the truth than Geoffrey could have known. The story spread, and as it spread it collected the monument's names. About 20 years after Geoffrey, a poet named Wace put the history into French verse for the English court, and he set the 3 names down together, like 3 coins laid side by side. The Britons, he wrote, in their own tongue call these stones the Giant's Dance. In English they are called Stonehenge, and in French, the Hanging Stones. The giants' dance, in the Old Welsh, the giants' round, the giants' choir, a ring of vast figures caught mid-step and turned to stone, which is exactly what the monument looks like on a grey afternoon when the light is going. And Stonehenge, the English name, the plainest and the oldest, which most likely means nothing so grand at all. It means the hanging stones, or the gallows stones, because a pair of uprights with a third stone laid across the top looks like nothing so much as an old two-post gallows with its crossbeam, and the people who named it were naming what they saw. That is where the matter rested, more or less, for the length of the Middle Ages. Merlin and giants and healing stones carried from Africa by way of Ireland. It is a good story. It is not, in any part, what happened, but it would be a mistake to be too pleased with ourselves about that, because parts of it rhyme with the truth in ways that are genuinely unsettling, and we will meet those rhymes as we go. For now, it is enough to say that the real story, the one the stones themselves have been slowly giving up, is stranger than the legend, and took far longer to assemble, and is still being written. Here is what the ground has told the people patient enough to read it. Stonehenge was not built. It was built and rebuilt over and over for something like 1,500 years by many generations who each inherited the work of the last and changed it to suit themselves. What stands now is not a single design. It is the sum of a very long argument, conducted in stone, between people who never met. It began, around 5,000 years ago, as almost nothing to look at. A great circular bank and ditch, more than 100 meters across, dug out of the white chalk with picks made from the antlers of red deer. The diggers left some of those antler picks lying on the floor of the ditch when they were done, and because antler can be dated, we know the ditch was cut in a window of about 80 years, a little before 3,000 years before the Common Era. There were no great stones yet. There was a white ring on the green plain, and inside it, almost at once, people began to bury their dead. For the first few centuries of its life, Stonehenge was a cemetery, the largest burial ground of its kind and its age known anywhere in Britain. The dead were burned, and their cremated bones were placed in the ring of pits inside the bank, perhaps 150 of them, perhaps more than 200. Before it was ever a monument of stone, it was a monument of the dead. That never entirely goes away. Whatever else Stonehenge became, it began as a place where people brought the people they had lost. The great stones came later, in a single tremendous phase of work, about 4,500 years ago. This is the Stonehenge of the postcards, the towering sarsens, the huge grey blocks, 30 of them once standing in a continuous ring with lintels laid across their tops, and inside that ring, 5 colossal archways, the trilithons, rising in a horseshoe. And threaded among the giants, then and for centuries afterward, were the smaller stones, the bluestones, which were moved and shifted and reset so many times that untangling their history has taken a lifetime of careful work. There was an early double arc of them, and later a circle, and later still another arrangement. The builders kept changing their minds, or changing their purpose, across the generations. There was even, we now know, a whole second stone circle a couple of kilometers away by the river, since dismantled, its sockets found only in this century. And the last prehistoric work of all was the digging of 2 more rings of pits outside the stones, some 1,500 years before the Common Era, after which the great remaking finally stopped. Somebody, at some point, dug the last hole, and set down the last tool, and walked away, and the argument in stone was over. It had lasted longer, from first ditch to last pit, than the entire span of time from the fall of Rome to the present day. To stand close to the great stones is to stop thinking of them as ancient and start thinking of them as heavy. The tallest of them still standing is one upright of the central archway, and it is about 9 meters long, with nearly 2.5 meters of that length buried in the ground to hold it up, and it weighs in the neighborhood of 30 tons. Its partner, once even taller, fell and broke in two some centuries ago and lies there yet. And these stones were not simply hauled into place and left rough. They were shaped, they were dressed and finished and fitted together with a care that has nothing to do with brute strength and everything to do with that cool word of Geoffrey's: skill. The people who raised them were, in their bones, woodworkers, and when they came to build in stone, they built the way they knew. Each upright of the outer ring was given a knob on the top, a projecting bump of stone, carefully carved, and each lintel that was to rest across two uprights had matching hollows cut into its underside, so that the lintel dropped down over the knobs and locked into place. A carpenter would know those joints at a glance. They are a mortise and a tenon, the joint for pegging a beam to a post, only here worked in blocks the weight of a small lorry. And the lintels did not merely sit side by side. They were locked to each other, end to end, by a tongue on one and a groove on the next, so that the whole ring of stones along the top became a single continuous hoop, a circle of stone floating on the pillars. They curved the lintels, gently, so the ring would read as a true circle and not a rough polygon of straight pieces. They swelled the uprights slightly toward the top, the same trick of the eye the builders of the Greek temples would discover a couple of thousand years later, so that a tall stone would not seem to taper and thin as it rose. This is not the work of people simply piling up rocks. This is design, considered and confident, and vain in the way that only very good work is vain. And a laser survey a few years ago found that the finest, most careful dressing of all was lavished on the stones that face the midsummer sunrise, as though the builders knew perfectly well which side of the monument people would be looking at, and made sure that side was flawless. Which leaves the oldest question, Henry's question: the how. Where did stones of 30 tons come from? And how were they brought across a country with no roads, and no wheels, and no beasts strong enough to pull them? For 400 years, everyone simply assumed the great sarsens had come from the Marlborough Downs, a stretch of high ground some way to the north, where such stones lie scattered on the surface. It was a reasonable guess. Nobody had ever tested it. And then, in the summer of 2020, it was tested, and the answer was both more precise and stranger than the guess had been. And it arrived by one of those small human accidents that the history of Stonehenge is unaccountably full of. Back in 1958, when one of the fallen stones was being set upright again, engineers had drilled 3 cores clean through the thickness of it to pin it back together, and one of the workmen had kept a core as a souvenir, a cylinder of Stonehenge about the length of a forearm, and had taken it home, and then taken it with him when he moved to America, where it sat on a wall in Florida for 60 years. In 2018, an old man, he sent it back, and that returned core, drilled from the living heart of one of the sarsens and never weathered, gave chemists a clean sample to work with. And when they compared its chemistry to the sarsen stones scattered across the whole of southern England, they found the match. 50 of the 52 great stones, still standing, had come from a single wood, a place called Westwoods near Marlborough, about 25 kilometers to the north. Not the open downs everyone had assumed. A specific patch of ground, which almost nobody had proposed, and which the builders had evidently chosen with care, and then hauled their giants away from, one at a time, 25 kilometers across the plain. And it can be done. People have shown that it can be done. The stones were not quarried out of a cliff. They were lying on the surface, and they were freed and dressed where they lay, pounded into shape with hammerstones, the brown, weathered rind knocked off to expose the paler, harder stone beneath, and then moved. A full-size replica of a 40-ton stone was once dragged along on a wooden sledge, running over a track of greased timbers, and it went, hauled by a large but not impossible number of people. To stand an upright, the builders dug a pit with one sloping side, tipped the base of the stone into it, and then hauled it upright. And the trick that worked best, when people tried it in our own time, was not to push, but to pull, with the weight of many bodies on the ropes and a wooden frame to change the angle of the pull. To raise a lintel 10 tons into the air, they built up a cradle of timber beneath it, levered it a little higher, packed more timber under, and levered again, walking it up into the sky a hand's breadth at a time. It is slow. It is patient. It needs many people fed and organized and kept at it over years. But it is not magic, and it is not giants. It is exactly what Geoffrey's Merlin said it was, without knowing he was right. Not strength, but skill. The great sarsens are only half the monument, though, and the other half came from very much further away. And this is where the story stops being about engineering and starts being about something harder to explain. The smaller stones, the bluestones, are the ones that were carried the impossible distance. They are not local. Victorian geologists worked that out well over a century ago, and in 1923 a geologist named Thomas traced them, or thought he traced them, to a particular range of hills in the far southwest of Wales, the Preseli Hills, in Pembrokeshire, more than 200 kilometres away overland, 140 in a straight line that no one could have walked in a straight line. Roughly 80 stones, each of them weighing a few tons, brought from a mountain in Wales to a plain in England, in the Stone Age, without the wheel. It is the single most difficult fact about Stonehenge, and unlike the sarsens, the how of it is still genuinely unsettled, an argument that has run for 100 years and is running still. The patient work of the last decade or so has found the actual places. Not a vague range of hills, but specific rocky outcrops. One crag matched to the stone by the chemistry of tiny crystals within it, another identified as the source of the spotted stones. And at those outcrops, archaeologists have found what look very much like Stone Age quarries, the recess where a pillar was levered out, the stone wedges, the working platforms. And when they dated the quarrying, they got a date some centuries older than the stone's arrival at Stonehenge, which raises a genuine and unresolved possibility that the bluestones first stood somewhere else, in Wales, in some earlier circle, for a few hundred years, before they were taken down and carried east. There was even a claim, a few years ago, that a particular dismantled Welsh circle was that first draft, a ring of the right size, robbed of its stones, with empty sockets that seemed to fit. It made headlines. And then, within a year, the same team's own geologists tested the sockets and could not make the match hold, and the claim was quietly softened and the question reopened. That is how this subject goes. A beautiful idea, an honest test, a walking back. It is not failure. It is what care looks like when it is applied to something this old and this thin in evidence. And there is a much older, rival explanation that has never quite died. Some geologists have argued, for 50 years now, that no one carried the bluestones anywhere, that a glacier did it, in the last ice age, scraping the Welsh rock loose and grinding it slowly eastward, and dumping it, eventually, somewhere within reach of Salisbury Plain, where much later people simply gathered up the strange stones they found lying about and put them to use. Most archaeologists do not believe this. There is no clear trail of Welsh rock left across the intervening country the way a glacier ought to leave one, and the freshly quarried look of those Welsh outcrops argues for human hands. But the glacier has not been finally disproved either, and the honest position, the position the best people in the field actually hold, is that the bluestones came from Wales, that people most likely brought them, and that exactly how remains open. If that were the end of the strangeness, it would be enough. But in the summer of 2024, the strangest stone of all gave up its secret and moved the whole problem into new country. There is, at the heart of Stonehenge, a single large flat stone, lying now on its back and half buried, that people have always called the altar stone, though there is no reason to think it was ever an altar. For 100 years, it had been lumped in with the Welsh bluestones, assumed to have come from the same southwest of Wales as the rest. And then, a team put its chemistry to the test, dated the tiny worn grains of mineral locked inside it, and read in them the signature of the rock they had eroded from. And the answer, when it came, did not point to Wales at all. It pointed to the far north of Scotland, to the old red sandstone of the Orcadian Basin, up past the Highlands, at least 750 kilometres away, the whole length of the island of Britain. A 6-ton stone, carried, if it was carried, from the top of Scotland to the middle of England 5,000 years ago. The people who found this cannot yet say how. Overland, the length of Britain, through forest and mountain and river, seems barely conceivable, and so they lean toward the sea. A long coasting voyage, in vessels we have no direct evidence for, hugging the shore, around the whole of a country. It is inference, not proof. Nobody has found the boat. But the plain fact remains, sitting there in the middle of the ring, that a stone from one end of the island was brought to join stones from Wales and stones from 25 kilometres off, and set down together in a single ring on Salisbury Plain, as though Stonehenge were built to gather the far corners of a whole country into one place and hold them there. And here, for anyone still keeping the old legend in the corner of the mind, there is a small, cold turn. Because Geoffrey of Monmouth, making it all up in the 12th century, with no possible way of knowing anything true about the matter, wrote that the stones had been brought from far away, from a distant land across the sea, and re-erected here. He was wrong about the giants, and wrong about Africa, and wrong about Merlin. But the shape of his lie, stones of strange virtue, carried an impossible distance and set up on the plain, turns out to be, in its bones, what happened. It does not make the legend true. The people who built Stonehenge were dust for 3,000 years before Merlin was dreamed up. But it is a haunting thing that the first story anyone told about how the stones came here, told in complete ignorance, should rhyme so closely with the last, hard-won findings of the laboratories. We keep meeting that rhyme, and it never quite loses its power to raise the hair on the arm. So much for the stones. But Stonehenge is also full of people. Not only the ones who built it, but the ones who were buried in it. And modern science has begun, very recently, to tell us who they were. Remember that before it was a ring of giants, it was a cemetery of the burned dead. Those cremated bones were dug up in the 1920s by an excavator who thought them worthless, and shoveled back into a single pit, jumbled together, and more or less forgotten. Until, in this century, someone thought to dig them up again, and ask them a question the 1920s could not have asked. Buried in the chemistry of a person's bones is a faint record of the ground they lived on, the rock beneath the grass they ate their food from, and even burning does not entirely erase it. And when the earliest Stonehenge dead were read this way, at least 10 of the 25 people tested had not grown up on the chalk of Salisbury Plain at all. Their chemistry pointed west. It pointed, as nearly as such a thing can point, toward Wales. Toward the very country the bluestones came from. So it may be that the stones did not travel alone, that the people who quarried them in the Welsh hills came east with them, and lived out their lives beside them, and were burned and buried here, in the ring their own stones had helped to make. The stones and the mourners took the same long road. And they were not the only travellers. 3 miles from Stonehenge, workmen digging for a housing development in 2002 found a grave, the richest grave of its age ever found in Britain. A man laid down with something like 100 objects, among them the 2 oldest pieces of gold known from this island. The newspapers called him the king of Stonehenge. He was not a king, but he was a stranger. The chemistry of his teeth, laid down in childhood, recorded winters far colder than any British winter, the winters of the high Alps in the middle of Europe. A man who had grown up somewhere near the Alps and walked or sailed the whole way to Britain and died within sight of Stonehenge around the time the great stones were being raised. He was buried with the tools of a metalworker at the very dawn of metal in Britain, which has made some people wonder whether he came for the monument or whether the monument was only the most famous thing near where he happened to settle. Either way, the picture that the graves and the bones are building is not of an isolated tribe raising a local wonder. It is of a place that pulled people toward it from across Wales and across Britain and across the sea from Europe. A place already 5,000 years ago that mattered to more people from further away than we had ever guessed. The clearest proof of that gathering is a mile and a half away, at a place called Durrington Walls, and it turns the whole picture warm. Because if Stonehenge was where the dead were, Durrington was where the living were. A great settlement of small houses, chalk-floored, with hearths and beds, where hundreds and perhaps thousands of people came together. And what they did there, above all, was feast. The rubbish they left behind is overwhelmingly the bones of pigs, tens of thousands of them, and the pigs tell a remarkably specific story. They were killed young, at about 9 months, and since Stone Age pigs were born in spring, killing at 9 months means killing in the deep of winter, around the midwinter solstice, the shortest, darkest day. And they were killed lavishly, wastefully, whole animals roasted and abandoned with the meat still on them, in the way that people waste food only when the wasting is the point, when the feast is meant to be remembered. And when the pigs themselves were tested, they had been raised all over Britain, some of them driven or shipped from as far as Scotland, converging on this one place to be eaten in a single midwinter blowout. So here is the shape of it. In the darkest week of the year, people came from the ends of the island, bringing their animals, to feast among the living at Durrington. And then, it seems, to process along an avenue to the river, and along the river, and up the great avenue to the stones, into the presence of the dead, at the exact turning of the year, when the sun stands lowest and begins, by a hair, to climb back. The plain around the stones is not empty either, and never was. To build Stonehenge was to begin a landscape, and for 2,000 years after the great stones went up, the powerful of the land went on choosing to be buried within sight of them, so that the low hills all around the monument are crowded with the round, grassy mounds of the Bronze Age dead, hundreds of them, gathered thickest along the near horizons, set so that the barrows look in toward the stones, and the stones sit ringed by their watching dead. The richest of those graves was opened on an autumn day in 1808 by a self-taught Wiltshire man named William Cunnington, digging for a gentleman patron, and what he found beneath a mound called Bush Barrow has never quite been equalled. There was a tall man laid out in the earth, and over his breast a great lozenge of sheet gold, thin as a playing card, incised with fine nested diamonds that had once been fastened to his clothing like a breastplate. There were 2 daggers and a bronze axe, and a curious mace with a head cut from fossil stone that a farmer, looking at it, said resembled nothing so much as an egg. But the most extraordinary thing in that grave was almost invisible, and was very nearly lost altogether. One of the daggers had a wooden handle, long since rotted to nothing, and that handle had been decorated, studded all over with tiny gold pins, each one thinner than a human hair, set into the wood in a pattern of narrow zigzags. When people came, much later, to reckon them up, they found there had once been something like 140,000 of these gold studs, each less than a millimetre long, driven into a single dagger handle by hand. The work is so unaccountably fine that a scientist who studies human eyesight concluded it could only have been done by children, or by adults short-sighted enough to focus at a hand's breadth, that somewhere in Bronze Age Wiltshire there was a bench of the young, or the near-sighted, bent close in a good light, setting gold pins into wood by the 10,000. Much of that gold dust was, in the end, swept up and thrown away by a Victorian museum cleaner who did not know what it was. But the work had been real, and it lay in the dark beside its owner for the better part of 4,000 years, within sight of the stones. And the monument had companions of its own kind. A little way off, another great ring had been raised, not of stone but of wood. 6 ovals of huge timber posts, long rotted away, its pattern found only in 1925, when a pilot flying over the plain looked down and saw dark rings in a field of wheat, where the buried post holes had left the soil a little richer and the crop a little greener. Woodhenge it is called now, and it seems to have kept an appointment with the same midwinter sun that the stones keep, a wooden echo of Stonehenge a mile away, and at its very centre the diggers came upon the small grave of a young child, laid at the heart of the rings, for reasons that, like almost everything here, went into the ground and did not come back out. Northward again stood Avebury, a circle of stones so vast that a whole village has grown up inside it, and beside Avebury the strange flat-topped cone of Silbury Hill, the greatest mound ever piled up by human hands in ancient Europe, 500,000 tons of chalk raised for a purpose no one has ever recovered. It is worth holding all of this together for a moment, the stones and the wooden rings and the crowded barrows and the great hill and the feasting town by the river, because it means Stonehenge was never a lonely wonder on an empty plain. It was the most famous corner of an enormous worked and sacred country, made and remade across thousands of years, most of which is simply gone, and the little we have found is only enough to be sure that we have found only a little. Which brings us at last to the sky. Because the one thing everyone knows about Stonehenge is that it points at the sun. And this is the rare popular belief about the place that happens to be true. The whole monument is laid out on a single line. Down the avenue, through the great gate, along the axis of the horseshoe. The stones are aligned on the 2 moments when the sun reaches the ends of its yearly journey and turns. The midsummer sunrise in the northeast, and, on the exact opposite bearing, the midwinter sunset in the southwest. That much is certain. It has survived every test. The stones and the sun keep an appointment that was fixed 5,000 years ago and has not slipped. The popular image is of the crowd at midsummer, watching the sun come up over the outlying heel stone. And that image is a little wrong in its details. And there is a real and interesting argument among people who study this about which solstice the builders truly cared for. The feasting evidence, the midwinter pigs, has swung many of them toward midwinter, toward the setting sun of the shortest day, not the rising sun of the longest, toward an end, that is, rather than a beginning. But that the monument is bound to the solstices, nobody now doubts. The trouble began when people tried to make it point at more than the sun. In the 1960s, an astronomer fed 165 points of Stonehenge, every stone, every hole, every mound, into one of the early room-sized computers, and asked the machine to test every line between every pair of them against every rising and setting point of the sun and the moon. And the machine found alignments everywhere. The astronomer announced that Stonehenge was an observatory, a computer of stone, and that one ring of pits in particular had been used to predict eclipses of the moon. His book was called Stonehenge Decoded, and it was a sensation, and it declared that there could be no doubt that Stonehenge was an observatory, that the impartial mathematics were on his side. And then the man who had actually spent years excavating Stonehenge with a trowel sat down to review the book and took it apart. His review was titled, with wonderful contempt, "Moonshine on Stonehenge." He called the book tendentious, arrogant, slipshod, and unconvincing. He pointed out that with enough stones and holes to choose from, and a generous margin of error, a line could be drawn to almost any point in the sky and called an alignment. That the machine had found not the builder's intentions, but the endless coincidences that any dense scatter of points will yield. The quarrel became public theatre, spilling into the newspapers and the reviews, the astronomer and the archaeologist trading blows in print. And the settled verdict, after all the dust came down, is the cautious one. The solstice alignment is real, deliberate, and central. The rest of it, the eclipse computer, the elaborate lunar machine, is very probably moonshine, the pattern hunger of the modern mind reading its own cleverness into a Stone Age ring. Which is only the latest version of the very oldest habit, standing in front of these stones and filling their silence with the contents of one's own head. That habit has a long and human history, and it is worth walking through, because the story of what people have believed about Stonehenge is nearly as strange as the story of the stones. For 5 centuries, as we have seen, the answer was Merlin. But when the medieval world gave way to a more sceptical age, the learned men of England looked at the stones afresh and began, one after another, to be wrong in more sophisticated ways. A great scholar of Queen Elizabeth's time described the monument carefully and pointedly declined to say who built it. Then a royal architect, surveying the stones for the king, decided they were a Roman temple and published a whole book arguing it, reasoning more or less that the work was too fine and too geometrical for the rude ancient Britons and must therefore belong to the civilized Romans. Another scholar answered that no, the stones were Danish, a place where the Danes had crowned their kings. The Roman party wrote back. The argument went round and round, each man confidently assigning Stonehenge to whichever people he happened to admire, and every one of them wrong, because the true builders were older than the Romans and the Danes and the Saxons by thousands of years, and none of these learned men had any idea that the human past ran back so far. They could not imagine the depth of time they were standing in, so they filled it, as everyone before them had, with the faces they knew. Then, by way of a fox hunt, came the Druids. On a winter's day in 1649, an antiquary named John Aubrey was out hunting when the chase led him across a village called Avebury, where he came upon the remains of an even vaster stone circle than Stonehenge, half forgotten among the houses. And Aubrey, turning it over, made the first genuinely good guess anyone had made, that these great circles were older than the Romans, native to Britain, and might have been temples of the ancient British priesthood the Romans had written about, the Druids. It was a reasonable idea. It had the enormous merit of at least reaching for something British and something old. And at Stonehenge, surveying it, Aubrey noticed a ring of shallow dips in the turf inside the bank that no one had remarked before, a ring of filled-in pits which are called to this day the Aubrey holes, after him. He had found, without knowing it, part of that first cremation cemetery. Aubrey's careful guess was taken up, a couple of generations later, by a clergyman named William Stukely. And in Stukely's hands, the Druids stopped being a cautious hypothesis and became a magnificent obsession. Stukely was, at his best, a superb field worker. He spent summer after summer at Stonehenge, measuring and drawing, and recording details that have since eroded away, so that some of what we know about the monument survives only because he wrote it down. He was the first to put into print that the axis pointed to the midsummer sunrise. He gave us the very word trilithon for those great 3-stone archways. But he also fell completely in love with the Druids. He dressed the monument in white robes and oak groves and mysterious priestly wisdom, imagined solemn ceremonies among the stones, wrote himself half into the part, and because he wrote so vividly and drew so beautifully, his Druid Stonehenge lodged in the national imagination and has never really left it. The irony is nearly perfect. The one thing we can now say with total confidence is that the Druids had nothing whatever to do with building Stonehenge. The Druids, so far as we know them at all, were priests of the Iron Age, of the last few centuries before the Romans came, which is to say they arrived on the scene more than 2,000 years after the last stone at Stonehenge was raised. The gap between the builders and the Druids is greater than the gap between the Druids and ourselves. No ancient writer ever connected the Druids to a stone circle at all. The Romans placed them in sacred groves, among the trees. And what finally, decisively cut the Druids loose from the stones was not an argument, but a measurement. The radiocarbon dating that, in the middle of the 20th century, at last gave the monument its true and enormous age, and pushed the builders back into a silence so deep that no named people, no Merlin, and no Druid could reach them. And yet the robes and the ceremonies did not go away. They simply arrived late and stayed. The photographs everyone has seen of white-robed figures greeting the solstice sun among the stones do not descend from any ancient rite. They begin in the 20th century with a revived, invented Druidry. A Georgian gentleman's society dressed up in a costume of what the Iron Age was imagined to have been, and with a specific man who, from around 1912, made a habit of solstice worship at the stones. The tradition that feels immemorial is younger than the motor car, which is, in its way, the whole history of Stonehenge in miniature, a genuinely ancient thing, around which every age drapes its own most cherished idea of the ancient, and then mistakes the drapery for the thing. Long before the scientists came with their isotopes and their lasers, the stones had taken up residence in the imagination of the country, and the painters and the poets went out to them the way people go to the sea, to stand in front of something large and feel their own smallness. The painter Turner set the ring under a storm, a great bruised sky splitting open above it, and a shepherd and his flock caught small and low beneath the weather, while the stones stood on unmoved, a picture of how little a single life seems to weigh against something so old. Constable painted them too, in his last years, crowned improbably with a double rainbow, the ancient grey stones and the passing English light held together in one wet, shining moment. And the novelist Thomas Hardy brought his doomed heroine, Tess, to Stonehenge at the very close of her story, walking with her across the black plain in the dark, until the two of them strike, without warning, some vast structure of stone. The wind, Hardy wrote, was playing upon the edifice and produced a booming tune, like the note of some gigantic one-stringed harp. She asks what the place is, and her companion answers that it is Stonehenge. And she asks, the heathen temple? And he says yes, older than the centuries, older than the d'Urbervilles. Hardy lays the exhausted woman down to sleep on one of the great flat stones, in the last quiet hour before the men come for her at dawn, and so he makes the oldest monument in England the bed on which she takes her final rest. The pagan stones keeping their patient watch over an ending that the law was about to call justice. It is among the most famous scenes in the whole of English fiction, and it fixed Stonehenge in the mind forever as a place of endings, and of a grave, unhurried grandeur older than any human sorrow. There is even a gentler visit to set beside that one, from the least likely caller of all. In his old age, Charles Darwin, long done with the voyages and the great dangerous book, grew quietly absorbed in earthworms, and in the slow, endless labour they do turning over the soil of the whole world. And to measure that labour, he sent to Stonehenge, because a fallen stone makes a perfect ruler. A great block cannot sink into level ground under its own weight, so if a stone that toppled long ago now lies half buried, the burying must have been done from below, grain by grain, by the worms bringing their fine castings up around it across the centuries. Someone measured for him how deep the fallen sarsens had settled into the turf, and from those few inches, Darwin reckoned how patiently the worms had been at work and set Stonehenge down in his very last book. A book not about temples or druids or the turning sun, but about worms and time, and the almost unimaginable slowness with which the living earth takes back whatever is laid upon it. There is something restful in the thought that all the while the antiquaries argued, and the poets grieved, and the crowds came and went, the worms went on working, unhurried, beneath the fallen stones, drawing them down into the soil a hair's breadth in a lifetime, in no more haste than the great stones themselves. By the start of the 20th century, the stones had also become simply property. And there is one more small human accident to tell, because it is how Stonehenge came to belong to everyone. For a long time, the monument sat on a private estate, and when the family that owned it fell on hard times, the heir killed in the First World War, the old man dead soon after, Stonehenge was put up for auction. It was sold in a theatre in Salisbury in September of 1915 as Lot 15, along with 30 acres of the surrounding down. The auctioneer opened by asking for £5,000 and got no takers, and had to coax the room. "Surely," he said, "someone will offer me £5,000. The bidding crept up in hundreds. At 6,000 he chided them, said it was impossible to value Stonehenge, and that 6,000 was poor bidding, and the numbers climbed a little further, and the hammer finally fell at £6,600. The man who bought it was a local barrister named Cecil Chubb, a village boy who had done well, and he had not gone there meaning to buy it at all. He said afterward that while he was in the room, he simply thought a Salisbury man ought to own it. There is a beloved story that he had been sent by his wife to buy a set of dining chairs and came home with a prehistoric monument to her considerable displeasure, and that story, charming as it is, appears to be a later invention, undocumented, the kind of tale that attaches itself to a good ending. What is documented is what Chubb did next. 3 years later, he gave Stonehenge to the nation. He handed it over by a deed of gift with a few conditions: that the public should always have access to it, that it should be cared for, and with that, the stones stopped being anyone's chairs and became everyone's inheritance. There is one honest thing left to say about the stones as they stand, because it surprises people, and the honesty of the place demands it. The Stonehenge on the postcard, the neat and balanced ring, is in part a 20th century restoration. Over the years, many of the stones had leaned or fallen. One great archway had crashed down and lain flat for 160 years, and across several campaigns of the last century, they were straightened and raised and, in a number of cases, set upright in concrete to hold them. Nearly every standing stone has been moved or steadied by modern hands. This is not a fraud, and it is not usually mentioned, and it changes nothing essential. The stones are the true ancient stones, in very nearly their true ancient places. But it is worth knowing that the serene, composed monument the camera loves is itself the latest layer of that long argument in stone. Our own age, quietly taking its turn, tidying the giants and propping them against the wind. And under all the science, and all the scholarship, and all the careful correction, the old folklore has gone on living beside the stones, the way ivy lives on a wall, indifferent to whether it is true, content simply to be told. There is the belief, one of the oldest recorded about the place, that the stones cannot be counted, that no one can go round the ring and tally them and come back to the same number twice. When the fugitive king Charles II hid near Stonehenge after losing a battle, his companion recorded that the king amused himself by counting the stones and reckoned the legend beaten. But the tale would not die, and a few decades later, Daniel Defoe set it down in its most famous form, the story of the baker who laid a loaf of bread upon every stone and yet could never make out the same number twice. Defoe, a hard-headed man, called it a mere country fiction and a ridiculous one, and he was right, and it did not matter in the least, and people are still gently losing count today. There is the devil, who in one tale bought the stones from an old woman in Ireland and flew them to the plain in a single night, and who, when a friar spied on him, flung a stone that struck the friar on the heel, which is why one of the outlying stones is sometimes called the friar's heel, though the truth of that name is genuinely lost and scholars have never settled it. There is the old belief that the stones could heal, that powder chipped from them and dropped into a well would drive out poison and sickness, a belief that goes straight back, across 700 years, to Geoffrey's Merlin and his mystical stones of a medicinal virtue, and which visitors acted on for centuries, chipping away at the monument with hammers they hired from the local inn, until the stones were pocked with the marks of their own reputation. None of it is true. All of it is part of the place. And there is a kind of justice in ending with the folklore rather than the findings, because the folklore has been more constant than any theory. The Romans came and went in the explanations, and the Danes and the Druids and the eclipse computer, each confident, each dethroned. The healing stones and the uncountable stones and the giants in their frozen dance simply carried on, asking nothing, proving nothing, keeping the wonder company through all the centuries in which no one could account for it. We can account for a great deal now. We know where the sarsens grew and which Welsh hills gave up the bluestones, and that one flat stone came the whole length of Britain from the north of Scotland. We know the ring began as a graveyard and grew for 1500 years, and drew its stones and its people and its very pigs from the far corners of an island. We know it keeps its appointment with the turning sun. And we still cannot answer the question Henry of Huntingdon asked, in the first sentence anyone ever wrote about the place, 900 years ago. For what purpose they were set there. We know how, at last, or nearly. We do not know why. And perhaps that is the right thing to carry away from the plain, out into the dark and towards sleep. That some things are made so well and meant so deeply that they outlast every explanation offered for them, and go on standing in the long grass, grey and patient and enormous, keeping their reason to themselves. The wind moves through them, as it has for 5,000 years, and will go on moving through them long after the last of tonight has gone. The stones do not mind being misunderstood. They were never in any hurry, and there is no hurry left anywhere on the darkening plain. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet, and let yourself rest. I will be here when you would like another.